there's a saying in cryonics, the second worst thing that can possibly happen to you is to be dead and frozen, right? Because that means you had to be dead first. On the other hand, the worst thing would be to be dead and not frozen. So yeah, if I could have my life extended and not have to be cryogenically suspended, that would be great. But it just doesn't exist. And what does exist is the vehicle to possibly get me to the future.
Welcome to Fringe FM, the podcast that explores the edges of human understanding and looks at the technologies, trends, and societal norms shaping our collective future. Here, the world's top minds share their insights and predictions on the convergence, direction, and ethics of exponential technologies transforming life as we know it. You can learn more and stay up to date at fringe.fm. As a species, we've always sought to overcome death. Whether religion in heaven or the fountain of youth, humans like to live and want to live as long as possible. Today, we're diving into an incredibly interesting and controversial subject, cryonics. Cryonics first came on my scene. We've all heard the stories of Walt Disney being frozen on ice, living forever. It all seemed a little bit crazy. I was listening to Wait But Why, the Tim Urban blog where he dives into very interesting topics and tries to explore them and break them down for average individuals. He was exploring cryonics, and the ultimate conclusion he came to is that cryonics is the process of pausing people in critical condition who can't accept the concept of death in the hopes that people from the future will be able to save them. And the community of hardcore cryonics people might also be a Scientology-like cult. Don't take this episode as an endorsement of cryonics. This is merely an endorsement of the interest I have, and others should have, in the future potentials and possibilities and the ability to create technology that seems seemingly impossible. So without further ado, I give you Dennis Kowalski.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, cryogenics is actually the science of freezing things at very low temperatures. Cryonics specifically is freezing people in the hopes that some future technology may be able to actually bring those people back. So if you think about it, we kind of do that already at a lesser degree with embryos. Right? We can freeze embryos indefinitely and implant them, and people are walking around today alive and well who've been frozen at liquid nitrogen temperatures. Sperm, eggs, skin cells, a lot of small tissues have been easily frozen down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, and viability hasn't suffered one bit. The million-dollar question is, can you scale that up to more complex tissues? And all the way up to freezing a whole person. And the answer is we can't revive people yet today. When they ask that question, could you do it with a lab animal, or could you do it, with a mouse or something like that, so we could prove in principle that this is possible? Well, that kind of is the paradox, because we're not in the future yet. If we were in the future, we could revive people. And that's what the whole purpose of cryonics is kind of medical time travel, right? An ambulance to a future hospital that may or may not exist in the future. And the only way you find out, if anything in science, the only way you find out what's possible is by pursuing it and running the experiment.
And I'm going to play stupid for some of this interview so that we're able to dive into as much of the questions as most people have. But Walt Disney, most famous person that's frozen on ice, right?
That's incorrect. There is rumors, and I can't substantiate them, that he was concerned and looking into being frozen in the 1960s or whenever he passed away. But it was also the same time that Time did a feature or was starting to do a feature article about cryonics. And I think the two stories kind of got mixed together. And I don't know if his family did actually ask about freezing or someone from his office did. I know that there was some rumors, but I can't substantiate that. And from what I heard, he was just buried in a regular cemetery plot in California.
Understood. So cryonics first came on my scene from Tim Urban with Wait But Why. He does deep dives into a lot of interesting things where you basically wait, you hear like, wait a sec, oh, why? And he dives into the science. Cryonics was fascinating for me because it is so far out that it seems impossible, but those are the type of things that we should be pursuing today. How did you get involved with cryonics?
Well, I heard about it when I was younger. I'm 50 years old actually today, and I heard about it when I was a young teenager. I remember watching a show called Phil Donahue. I don't know if you remember or are familiar with that. And it was a talk show, and they spoke about, they had some cryonicists on there talking about the subject, and I thought, well, this is really interesting. Now, previously, I had seen it on, science fiction shows and, people going through space travel or whatever, using a form of cryogenic suspension to get from point A to point B. But it was kind of a shocker to me that there was people actually doing it. And that was in the mid 1970s. Well, I thought to myself, that's really interesting. But again, how are they going to ever be able to bring anyone back? Is it entirely just relying on the future, pie in the sky? So then later in the 1980s, I've always loved science. So I read a lot of science books, including science fiction. And I was reading a book called Engines of Creation by Eric Drexler. Now, that book talked about reverse engineering life itself. And he was laying out how to hack into your, DNA and actually the molecular processes at almost the atomic level. What's the mechanics going on? If we could really see what life is doing, we could mimic everything that life does, and what the magic that would bring to the manufacturing process and everything else that we do in life would be unbelievable. And it's not as if we'd have to invent something new, that doesn't exist, like anti-gravity or time travel. This is features that actually exist in nature that just haven't been fully reverse engineered yet. So the ability to, duplicate and replicate molecular patterns over and over to build bigger and more intricate structures is basically what life does. So this Engines of Creation basically outlined how to reverse cryonics. Just not easy to do, very hard to do. We're not there yet. We'll probably be there in the future. But the important thing to note is if nature can do it, there's no scientific or physical reason we can't do it. So, it's just as we were having this debate, about whether we'll ever have heavier than air flight, maybe back in Da Vinci's time. And one person's arguing, yes, we will. And one person's arguing, no, we won't. But you can always point out that these heavier than air birds are flying by as you're having the conversation. So again, nature has tackled, and through evolution, tackled the problem. And it's just a matter of us reverse engineering what nature does.
And longevity is fascinating. It's related to what you're interested in cryonics in terms of living longer. It's slightly different mechanisms. I'm not sure what the relationship is like between the cryonics community. Hey, Matt here. Quick aside. While we've had some speculative longevity experts on, we'll be focused much more on getting some scientists and researchers focused on health, nutrition, and the ability of human enhancement and long-term living on the program soon. We've got some of the best, a couple of the top speakers from TED to be coming on the program, and I'm very excited to bring you those. And if you guys have forgotten, my goal is to live to be 153 and add 10 to 15 years on the human lifespan, in the average human lifespan over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. I'm going big, I'm going bold, and that's 10x. But the reason behind that is, if you don't try, of course you'll never make it. So we're going to shoot from the moon and reach the stars. Now let's jump back.
There's a whole kind of a field of philosophy called transhumanism. People who, are incredibly optimistic about the future, and they believe that future technologies will be able to do things that are magical by today's standards. Now think about that. Now, I've got this cell phone in my hand here that, 20 years ago would not have been possible. It would have been like a crystal ball, right? I can contact people all over the globe in real time, and I can access all the knowledge of mankind at my fingertips. But we have Google, we have our smartphones, and this technology exists. 100 years ago, if I said I could raise the dead by pounding on their chest and maybe shocking them with electricity, they might have ran me out of town by saying that I was, Frankenstein or something, but that's exactly what we do all the time through CPR and cardiac defibrillation. So you have to almost really step outside contemporary thinking and look at what is possible, not in such a way that I'm not talking about metaphysical stuff. I'm talking about grounded in basic science, just what's not possible yet, but will most likely be possible in the future. And that's all really what we're doing at Cryonics. It's a bet on the future. Now, I didn't fully answer your previous question. I'm going to get back to that a little bit. How did I get myself into Cryonics? Once I read that book about reverse engineering life, I realized, boy, there is actually a blueprint for this. This isn't just someone's, purely a dream. There's a blueprint, and it's just a matter of us pursuing it. The beauty of Cryonics is you have all the time in the world to wait for science to catch up. So sometime in my 30s, I started thinking about this, and I signed up with the Cryonics Institute. I filled out a life insurance policy, and I thought, well, this is only for the rich, right? This is only way out of my economic means. But it turns out that a simple life insurance policy pays for the interment, or basically that money gets put into an endowment, and that's what runs the perpetual overhead that pays for you to stay in liquid nitrogen. So like taxes, utilities, more liquid nitrogen, it gets invested, that money, just like a regular endowment would, and that's what pays for the perpetual nature. Then after some time of being a member, I got a little bit more involved. The organization that I'm with, Cryonics Institute, is a nonprofit. It is also democratically run by its members. So as you sign up as a member, you get a vote. And I was voted in as on the board of directors, and then eventually I was voted in as the president of the Cryonics Institute. And that's kind of how I got involved, step by step.
It's fascinating for me. There was a football player a while back. Unfortunately, I'm a Buffalo Bills fan, which means I've suffered through many, many horrible years. But I don't remember what his name was. He was a tight end. He got hit. He broke his spine, and they froze him on the way to the emergency room. He was already paralyzed. He was never going to walk for the rest of his life. And the doctors were able to save him because of the fact that he was frozen. And he was back to walking, running, and to working out within a year. And it was just incredible. So that's part of the reason why it was very interesting for me, just the ability of the human body to recover and recuperate.
So to clarify, they probably didn't freeze them. They probably used what's called therapeutic hypothermia. They cool them down very cold. And when they do that, that slows down the metabolic need of the cells and gives them time to heal. Now, in essence, that is what we're doing, though, on a much grander scale, right? We're giving your body time to catch up with medical science itself. So I just wanted to clarify. I don't think they actually froze him, but you're right. It's the same actual process. Cooling slows down chemical reactions and metabolic activity, and that buys you time. And you're starting to see that now much more in conventional medicine. People with heart attacks and strokes, they're cooling their blood, so it can buy them time. Again, these things were all impossible just a decade or two ago.
And it's even obvious, like just with what athletes are doing with taking ice baths for recovery. It's much of the same mechanism, slightly different in terms of your more pressing pause versus rewind. But it's very interesting for me. Talk through how cryonics exactly works and what some of the misconceptions are. Warning, if you're a bit squeamish, we're about to get a little bit more into the heebie-jeebie grossness factor. It's very interesting, it's incredibly technical, and it's very valuable to understand the process, but if you can't handle it, then it may be something you want to fast forward through the next 5 or so minutes. Now, let's go back to the creepiness and the crazy possibilities.
Lots of misconceptions, but let's talk about the process. So under good circumstances, right, you would pass away in a situation where there's people around you, okay, because there's several ways you can go, right? You can die planned, unplanned, and unwitnessed. And unwitnessed is being the worst case for us. You're in the woods and you're hiking. We do have some remedies for that, like GPS, pulse detecting watches and stuff like that kind of send out a signal that I need help, I'm here, like a life alert. But under excellent circumstances, let's say you had told all your family and friends, they knew that this was your wishes. You got everything in play ahead of time. You signed up with the Cryonics Institute. You talked to your funeral director, your doctors, and everyone, and you had all the equipment at your bedside, and you had a terminal illness that was not causing problems with your brain, maybe a cancer in the pancreas or something like that. And in that case, as soon as you're declared legally dead, as soon as your heart stops or you go into cardiac arrest, as we call it in the paramedic community, then we continue CPR, not to bring you back, but to continue to keep the tissues nourished with oxygen and nutrients. And then we put you into an ice bath. And we continue with the CPR while you're in the ice bath. What's going on there is you're feeding the brain oxygen and nutrients, but you're also cooling the body down even faster because you're exchanging the warm core blood with the colder or peripheral blood at the skin. And so you're cooling the core down as well. And that's the important thing. We want to cool down your core of your body and your brain. And once we do that, after a while, that slows down your metabolic need to the point we don't even need to do CPR anymore. We also inject in heparin and blood thinners so that your blood doesn't gel up and coagulate. But we don't freeze you completely at that point. Then we would transport you, if you're within a 10-hour radius of the Cryonics Institute, as fast as possible to our facility, where we would surgically open up your carotid arteries and veins, and we would perfuse in a type of biological antifreeze. It's a formula that was developed by a cryobiologist who was, his specialty was preserving tissues at extremely low temperatures. So mostly cryobiologists now work with embryos and stem cells and pathogens and stuff like that. So anyways, the cooling process in the beginning is just protecting you and buying you enough time to get to the facility. Then once you're at the facility, then we put this biological antifreeze in you. And this antifreeze, what it does is it keeps the ice crystallization from forming in the interstitial spaces, the spaces between your cells. That ice crystallization can do damage.
Basically, water expands when it freezes.
Right. You've seen it in your freezer, right? So it's the same thing, but it's not inside the cells. It's actually between the cells, and then it would crush the cells. So these cryobiological agents, basically, they were reverse engineered, by the way, from natural organisms that have these proteins and these substances in their bodies. There's our North American Arctic frogs, freeze solid. There's other insects that freeze solid. And anyone who's been outside in a super cold weather says, well, how do those insects and animals make it? Well, a lot of them hibernate in a natural cryogenic or kind of cryonic suspension of their own. So we've kind of reverse engineered, again, what Mother Nature has already done and came up with a formula that is not perfect, but it definitely protects the cells much better than had that formula not been perfused into your body. So we kind of hook you up to the equivalence of a cardiac heart-lung bypass, and we tap in and we push out the blood. We push the cryoprotectant in. This cryoprotectant is much colder than liquid ice or than solid ice, but it's still in liquid form, and it's able to perfuse your tissues. Then we bring you down into a cooling chamber as fast as possible to about negative 100 degrees Celsius. And then after that, we gradually bring you down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, which is in Fahrenheit, negative 451 degrees. So it's pretty cold. At that point, you can stay in a pretty much indefinite state of pause, and nothing changes. There's no chemical reactivity going on. There's no decay. There's no breakdown. I mean, and we kind of know this intuitively. You take your potato salad out on a hot summer day on a picnic, it's going to spoil. If you put it in the fridge, it's going to last longer. If you put things in the freezer, it'll last that much longer in dry ice. It's an exponential in reverse. So 1 second becomes a minute, becomes an hour, becomes 10,000 years real quick. And so you've got all the time in the world to figure out, are we going to have the technology to reverse engineer life itself at the mechanical level? And we're starting to see bits and pieces of that with stem cell research, for instance. Artificial intelligence, right? Computers are getting so advanced that they're able to pick apart the human genome. We're starting to see like CRISPR-Cas9, if you're familiar with that, a method of genetically engineering and changing the genes and swapping in and out for organisms. So once this is all coming together and leading to a world that we should be able to slow down, even reverse aging, and in fact, revive cryonics patients. So cryonics is kind of like the ultimate life insurance policy if we don't figure out how to reverse aging.
Assuming that we never lose power in the world. It's incredibly fascinating, incredibly creepy, a little bit cultish sounding, but at the same time incredibly promising. And that's why I wanted to get you on, because it is this strange mixture of sci-fi, future, current potential, and just enough out there that it makes your feet curl a little bit. How did people first get into this? What's the story of how cryonics first came about? How did someone discover or dive into some of these procedures to make something like this possible?
Well, Robert Ettinger, a professor of physics in Michigan, was a science fiction buff like myself. But back in the 1950s, he read a lot of science fiction. And as a physics professor, he started examining the idea. He thought, boy, this is really interesting. There was a story about it was about a gentleman who goes up into space and freezes, and then some advanced alien race unfreezes him. And he thought to himself, from a physics standpoint, is this actually possible? So he ran all the figures, being a scientist, and he said, boy, this actually could work. Doesn't mean that you can, he didn't have the science for bringing people back. If he had that, he'd already be famous for curing all disease and aging. But he just knew that he could stabilize patients or people to a point where maybe in the future, the other side of the coin would be solved.
I don't know about you, but I find it interesting that science fiction and suspending reality seem to have such positive impacts on creativity, innovation, and the future of technology. If we look into how many times things were impossible, and then people just decided to look into how exactly this works, what are the numbers, and what would be necessary, it's the first principles thinking of Elon Musk and many of the other great innovators and entrepreneurs that changed the world. So I'd invite you to think outside the box from time to time. Now let's jump back.
Now, just you did talk about like the creepy factor or the ick factor. I've been in orthopedic surgeries. I mean, there's a lot of primitive, looking and sounding.
They're duct taping it just to put you back together somehow.
Yeah. I mean, and there's others. I mean, think about organ transplantation. I mean, from a primitive standpoint, I mean, right now we accept it. It's normal. But maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago, if I said I was going to take a heart or a liver out of a freshly dead corpse and stitch and sew it into someone, I mean, how creepy does that sound? Yet we all benefit from the wonderful life-saving techniques that have been born out of that science. So I think it's all good, and it's what we're doing. We're fighting the good fight. If cryonics doesn't work at all, if it never works and comes to fruit, we're still advancing science by finding out what is or is not possible. My hope is that it will work, and then that'll be a great thing because we'll have saved countless lives, and that's a good thing. That's the fighting the good fight. That's what I do as a paramedic in my day job. When people go into cardiac arrest, we don't always win. We don't always bring them back, but we try to fight the good fight at least. And I love life. I love my family. And so that's what the whole thing, I love science, and it's all kind of wrapped into one.
It's fascinating. So in preparation for this, I did a little bit of research into in vitro fertilization, and it looks like with embryos, they have a 60 to 70% success rate of bringing frozen embryos back to implant. Essentially, you go through the IVF process, then you have all of these eggs, you might have leftover embryos. Let's save some for later, just in case, right? Well, it's a 60 to 70%. So that kind of already verifies that something like this is possible. You can freeze a human being and then bring back a human being. It may not be quite as advanced as the human beings in cryonics, but it's kind of, I like the pause analogy of if you're in a country in the 1900s, a hospital might not be able to help you. Today it's very different.
That's correct. And in 60, 70%, that number might be 100% in another 10 years, depending on the technology that comes on board with the implantation of those embryos. So
I have a question now for you. With cryonics and going forward, there are some inherent challenges. So the power one I brought up earlier, the other one that I think of, which is even more terrifying, would be the concept of oftentimes today, if you're living in a country that's just doing terribly, you try to get out of the country, you get smuggled out, and then it turns out that the traffickers sell you into the sex trade or something terrible. How do people deal with that process of coming back alive and not having to reset?
Well, thanks for bringing up the power thing. That is one of the misconceptions. We don't use electricity. There's no refrigeration systems. So basically, it's even simpler than that. It's a giant thermos bottle that's filled up with liquid nitrogen. If we ran out of liquid nitrogen, that thermos bottle is so insulated so well, it would take 5 to 6 months before we ran out of liquid nitrogen. But we don't wait that long. We top it off every week, and we measure it every single day, not mechanically, but physically. So there's no electricity to fill. And even so, we do have backup generators and so forth. But to the bigger question, though, what could go wrong? Or a tornado could hit the place. We could have a nuclear war. When it comes, you could what if everything. It basically comes down to the fact that we're optimistic. And, what if things go right? What if everything does work out? So the way I look at it is we have no control over the bad things that can happen. And in that case, you'd be no worse off than someone who's buried or cremated.
Exactly.
But if, on the other hand, this works, you could be sitting, into the future with a whole new life and all the fantastic awe that would bring.
A quick related tangent. As an angel investor, one of the investors that I've looked up to and learned quite a bit from is Jason Calacanis, host of This Week in Startups. He has a saying when it comes to investing, and it's that you don't have to think about what could go wrong. It's just what could go right. If everything lines up, the stars align, how big could this go? What happens if this goes right? That's what angel investors, and founders need to think about, because the law of exponential returns applies to both investing and creating the future, especially technology, because what happens if it all goes right?
Now, but yeah, there's things that could go wrong. The whole ideal of the dystopian world or whatever, where they're going to wake you up just to torture you or whatever, that seems pretty unlikely. I mean, anything's possible, but it seems very unlikely to me, because why would you go through all that effort to bring someone back if you want slave labor or something like that? I mean, if you have that technology to bring someone back, most likely you'd have robot technology. You'd have other things that you wouldn't need slaves, or you wouldn't need, it would be a benevolent world, so it's almost inherent that the world, to be that advanced, would have to be somewhat benevolent. But I don't really get too much into the future, because nobody knows the future, even though this is premised on the idea that the future is going to be good. So
It's interesting. I'm an angel investor and work with a lot of early stage companies. And one of the biggest factors you see for startups failing is timing. It's interesting that you can put timing on the back burner. It doesn't really matter when, as long as it happens at some point.
Well, and interestingly enough, too, the timing is, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, not a whole lot was happening. These people were just frozen at liquid nitrogen temperatures. Now you're seeing all this technology about stem cells, advanced AI, molecular nanotechnology, things that just are out of this world advanced. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. So I think there may come a time when people with a lot of money might start looking into cryonics and say, what have I got to lose? I mean, the cost is pretty minimal. I mean, I could spend a lot more money on frivolous things And if it ever becomes, if actual life extension starts to become more viable, there's always going to be some people that are just too old and they're just going to miss out on the technology, right? The magic pill or whatever drugs come on market to prolong your life or extend your life. The beautiful thing about cryonics is it is that backup, the ultimate backup policy, right? So if people, if wealthier people, start looking into this, maybe, it'll be the tip of a good thing to invest into. Right now, we're pretty much, we stay nonprofit, but I think there could be a lot of profit in actually extending human life and having the ultimate backup policy. But who knows? Only time will tell on that.
Entrepreneurs out there, if you think anti-aging and beauty products are a gold mine, think again. If we can extend the human life, there's nothing more profitable, more fulfilling, or more important as a social mission. What happens as we move towards an infinite or a significantly extended lifespan in terms of humanity, population, and just the overall, the overall.
Well, the universe is a big place. Some people talk about overpopulation, but we may need a lot more people to colonize the solar system or even further out. And the way I look at it is, again, we have this really advanced technology to bring someone back. We're going to have some pretty advanced space travel technology and communications, and everything else is going to be, infinite levels ahead of where we are now. So I think that the ability for the world to handle revived patients should be a spit in the bucket. People also, one of the other things about overpopulation, people dying right now, but having multiple children, that's an exponential again. So if I die at the age of 30, but I've had 10 children, and my 10 children have 10 children, we're already up to 100, and that's with death at an early age. So having babies, mathematically speaking, is exponential. People not dying, one begets one, is kind of a linear mathematically. So I don't see overpopulation as an issue. In fact, I see the largest, most important resource we have is the intellectual property that's in our brains. Your family, your friends, what means the most to you. And that's what we're saving. We're saving the minds of our loved ones and the lives of our loved ones. There's ideas too that they'll be able to maybe extrapolate the information out of people's brains as well, maybe upload those. But that gets even far-fetched for me. But there's certainly nothing in the laws of physics that says that's not possible.
That was my next question. So in terms of how people could be brought back to life, there were a couple of possibilities: same body, new body, uploaded, or robot. I don't know if you had a thought in terms of which would be most likely.
Well, I'm kind of attached to my body, pun intended. But the way I look at it, I don't know. Nobody will know the future. It could be something way out of left field that I never even thought of. But certainly all those things seem like viable possibilities. Again, without knowing the future, being purely speculative because of the fact that I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd sometimes, I look at things like, would we be able to reverse engineer a virus that cross-checks your DNA at what you should be at a healthy age of 20? It looks at the DNA and the cells where you're at now and starts repairing and multiplying within your body, kind of like a virus that doesn't make you sick but actually makes you healthy and starts resetting the clock. What if we're able to ramp up your stem cells to a level where you're just naturally healing yourself from within? What if there's a mechanical version of that, some type of robotics that are miniature nano robotics that are able to divide and fix you from within? These are all ways just to fix your existing body, for instance. Other ways, maybe that's not doable. Maybe some sort of a scan that actually scans where every cell in your brain is and extrapolates the information out, just like a giant computer, and downloads you into a Android or some other system so that you can live indefinitely in the software. I don't know. That starts getting funny and philosophically weird, because I say, well, then, if they could do that now, let's say I, jumped into the transporter, Star Trek style, and then I was beamed over here, but let's say that things screwed up and made two copies. Well, which one is really me? It starts to get philosophically weird. I would still claim I'm me, and the other me would claim that's me. But yet, as strange as these philosophical things seem, these are kind of happening already to a degree in nature. So, as we eat food and bring in new molecules and your body assembles them into your brain, and as life goes on, you shed off skin and, use the bathroom, and all these other molecules leave, there's actually evidence that the material that is you is coming in and going out, and it's not the same. You're not the same person, literally, physically, that you were in the past. So there's already kind of an idea that maybe if you're not the physical stuff, then what are you? You're the information, the software. So if that's the case, then maybe you could be uploaded into a computer and it would be you just the same. But me personally, I'd want my body back, and that's just my own personal belief system. But it gets complex. It gets pretty deep.
Well, we didn't jump into consciousness on this episode. I'm looking into having some expert along the lines of a Sam Harris on the podcast so we can really dive into what it means to be human, what it means to be alive and sentient, and that we can better understand ourselves and our environment and the universe we're living and interacting with. If you've got any great suggestions, matt@fringe.fm or on Twitter @itsmattward. Do you think we'll get to a VR world before we get to a revive world? Well, like revive people from cryogenics versus a Ready Player One type.
I really don't know. Honestly, that's a good question. I don't know. It seems like both technologies seem to be advancing in parallel. Brain scanning to understand the brain so that you could physically repair it is parallel to brain scanning to copy and simulate it in another computer system. So you're going to need some of the same tools to do either. So which will come first? It's kind of a chicken and the egg type of question. It's a tough question. It's a good question, but I don't know. I guess would be that they're both going to come along the same time.
So in terms of cryonics, how many people today are frozen or vitrified?
There is over 2,000 people signed up with us. Probably, if you want to add up the whole world, because there's several organizations out there, probably about 4,000 or 5,000. There's organizations in Russia, Australia, and so forth. Cryonics says to it, we have 170 people, about 120 pets, animals, hundreds of
really?
tissues. Yeah.
Wow. So almost as many pets as people. Does that mean essentially almost every person is bringing their pet along for the ride?
No, some people just have saved their pets in the hopes that cloning techniques will pick up and they'll be able to maybe, clone their pets and maybe some people actually want to try to bring back their pet in their lifetime, since the pets have a much shorter lifespan than their owners. And funny about that is when we started this, that was not a possible thing to do. But today there's a company called Perpetuate, I think, and there's another company that in Korea that will actually clone your dog for you. It's a lot of money. It's a couple $100,000 or something, and they can clone your pet. So who knows what will be possible in the future? Maybe these people plan on living, they're younger people and they lost their pet and their pet's their loved one, and they're hoping that in their lifetime they might be able to revive their pets. So it's not as if every single person in cryonics has a pet. There's probably more pets that their owners are just alive right now, and maybe they're planning on getting frozen themselves later, but they're not actually in suspension yet.
That makes sense. It was a stupid question on my part. So I'm talking with Aubrey DeGray in a couple of days. He's one of the leading researchers on aging. He believes that there's humans alive today that will live to be 1,000. What are there any type of potential problems between cryonics and longevity? Technically, it is kind of like a competitive business, although it's both geared towards the same outcome.
Well, I'd love to see longevity work. I'd like to be put out of business by the longevity crowd. Then there's a saying in cryonics: the second worst thing that can possibly happen to you is to be dead and frozen, right? Because that means you had to be dead first. On the other hand, the worst thing would be to be dead and not frozen. So, yeah, if I could have my life extended and not have to be cryogenically suspended, that would be great. But it just doesn't exist. And what does exist is the vehicle to possibly get me to the future. So it's a backup plan more than anything. And of course, there's people who actually didn't. They thought that might happen too. They thought longevity might come along in science and save them, and they're now frozen with us because time caught up with them and time won over versus the science. But the beauty of cryonics is you can keep waiting over longer and longer. So it's almost as if I'm a firefighter. So do I support fire safety, right, and education so that we don't have fires, which ultimately puts me out of a job? Yes, I do, because that's progress. And if we don't need firefighters, that would be a good thing. But until we have a totally fire-safe world, we're going to need firefighters.
So you got into this more from a sci-fi background and less from a technical background. I'd like to learn a little more about what some of the other members are like, what your average distribution is, like job title, ages, geographies, etc., just to learn a little bit more about who's currently undergoing, or you probably can't tell me undergoing, but interested in cryonics.
Sure. I would say our base, if that's what you're looking for, is there's probably more males than females predominantly. Definitely the one thing that links us all together is an interest in science fiction and optimistic viewpoint towards the future, futurism. That links us all. But I would say most of us tend to have some to more college education. There's quite a few people that are I noticed that are PhDs, or they have, Mensa certificates. Very smart people, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. But we do have people of all different ethnicities, financial backgrounds and religions. And I mean, we have people that are atheists and people that are fundamentalist Christian. And it shouldn't be terribly surprising, because you can get a heart transplant and be both an atheist or a different religious persuasion, Jewish. One of the guys on our board of directors is Orthodox Jewish. So, his family thinks that it goes against God, but he thinks it's God's will. So it depends on how you interpret it. My point has always been, if it's no different than getting a heart transplant. It's either going to work or not work, no matter what your religious persuasion is.
Yeah, I have a hard time figuring out how religious people could justify anything medical, but that's a whole nother story. I want to jump into, what other big problems do you see in the world, and what would you like to see people tackle?
I'd love to see actual functioning molecular nanotechnology. So again, if we could reverse engineer life at that point, if we could build little molecular robotic machines that could mimic life, make copies of themselves with the surrounding parts and tools, the atoms that are around them, we could do almost anything, right? We could feed the world. We could cure aging and almost all disease. We could open up at least the solar system to space colonization. I mean, we'd live fantastically wealthy, every person, and with plenty of space and almost zero pollution. And it all sounds really pie in the sky, but that's actually technology that exists within nature if exploited or reverse engineered properly. I'd love to see that, because that would really solve all the other problems down the line, including cryonics.
Yeah, the biggest problem with nano is it's just so hard to manufacture at those scales that no one's been able to do it to date. Interesting.
It is, but Mother Nature does it all the time. Our bodies are filled with nanomachinery. So it's really amazing. People who say that nanotechnology is impossible, well, you wouldn't exist if we're made of nanomachines that are functioning and doing what nanomachines do.
Fair point.
They're just nature's version.
What are you most excited about today outside of cryonics?
I'd have to say I love, I get back to nanotechnology, but also I love artificial intelligence, because I think once you can develop machines that can think faster and better than humans, wow, the sky's the limit, right? Because then the exponential nature of that means we're going to be living in a whole different world. We can't even fathom the wonders of technology that we're going to have if that happens.
Absolutely.
And we seem to be on the cusp of that as well.
I think that's one of the challenges with exponential technologies, is you always feel like you're on the cusp, especially the closer that you are to the technology. But then it's always takes longer and also goes faster than people expect. So it's really challenging to predict, but that's part of the fun of getting interesting people like you on the program.
Kind of like space travel, right? I mean, we landed on the moon, and then all of a sudden, what happened? We haven't been back there in all this time. But there's time coming when it's going to become more routine. You look at the greater scale of exponentials, it seems almost as if everything has just happened in the last 100 years, right? I mean, for thousands of years, we rode horses, right? Or we didn't have refrigeration. We didn't really have electricity for thousands of years. And also in the last 100, 200 years, everything seems to have been invented. That's the exponential nature of the Industrial Revolution, and now the technology and information revolution.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Previously, history was war, and it spanned for very long times with very little happening. And now it's very much technology and change happening at such a rapid pace that people aren't able to keep up.
Right.
So you mentioned sci-fi. You mentioned being a bit of a geek. What's your favorite sci-fi book? What really got you into the world of the future?
Oh, yeah. I've read a lot of stuff from Richard Feynman, a physicist. I definitely, like I said, Engines of Creation by Eric Drexler, nanotechnology. When I was younger, I read. I was an avid subscriber to Omni magazine. I don't know if you recall Omni magazine. That kind of took some very deep and technical scientific things and brought it down to the layman. So I could read this when I was in high school, and that was one of my favorite magazines to read. And that branched me off into reading a lot of other stuff about AI. I'm a fan of movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, the HAL 9000 computer. We almost have that now to a degree. We're getting on that level with the Google supercomputers and so forth. It's pretty amazing stuff. And who knows where it's going to take us. And that's why I kind of want to be part of the future. And I look at it like I got nothing to lose. Nothing to lose when I get older. I'm either going to be buried, cremated, or frozen. And for the expense. It's not that much money for my family, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Great power, great responsibility. We're jumping into a really interesting era. I want a challenge for the listeners now, and ask her a challenge, something that you think people should look into, do, etc.
A challenge that people should look into? I think people need to put down their Facebooks and a little bit of their entertainment, watching television, and actually try to read a little bit about what's happening in science news, business news, and really see what's happening in the world, because things are changing quick. And if you don't keep your eye on the ball, you're going to miss out on a lot of really fascinating, neat things that are coming our way. And, instead of absorbing ourselves in the fictional world, the reality is actually stranger than fiction. I mean, it's really fascinating things that are happening right now. And this is a fascinating age to live in, and it's only going to speed up and get even more fascinating.
I completely agree with that. The era of one-and-done education is completely over. If you're listening to Fringe FM, you probably get that. We're going to get the world's smartest, best, and most interesting individuals on so that we can talk about the converging and exponential technologies tomorrow. Thanks for coming on today, Dennis. Where's the best place for people to find you? Sorry. Where's the best place for people to find you?
We're on all the social media, but one of the best places is just to go to www.cryonics.org, org, not com, but org, and it's cryonics plural, and all the information that you ever wanted to know about cryonics is there. We've got YouTube videos, we lay out our technical arguments about why what we're doing is feasible. We've got peer-reviewed scientific papers that support what we're doing, 62 PhD signatories that signed on that say that what we're doing is not cargo cult science, but just cutting edge. And so there's plenty of information on our website at cryonics.org.
And don't try this at home, people. Freezing yourself is not a great idea. We'll throw links and everything in the show notes. I'm still not 100% sure how I feel about cryonics, other than it is a very fascinating and potentially transformative field. That's what I think I would leave people with, is not to write off things that could be the future just because they seem a little bit strange in the present.
Thank you, Matt.
If you want more of Fringe FM, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or go to fringe.fm, where you'll find tons of audio and video interviews with leaders in the fields of genetics, cryptocurrency, longevity, AI, space, VR, and much, much more. And you can follow me on Twitter at @It'sMattWard. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a quick review in iTunes to help more people discover Fringe FM.